So good morning, friends. It is a privilege to be in worship with all of you today, and I want to say a word of thanks to Reverend Rachel for the kind invitation to share with you on this Sunday as we really set some time aside to reflect deeply on a reality in our nation, a reality in our world, gun violence, and then what we can do in terms of gun violence prevention. So I want to share with you, well, first thing I want to share with you is the litany that you read this morning, and I hope you'll go back to it, that begins, "Today is the day." This is a litany that I hope you can feel proud of. It is the one litany that was actually written globally by the United Methodist Church, talking to our sisters and brothers coming across Africa, the Philippines, Eurasia, Europe, and the United States, to come together and say, what in a social creed would we want to say God is doing in the world today, and what is our response to what God is doing in the world today? Similar to what Mark Miller is framing within the song that we heard sung this morning. So it's a global appeal to peace. It's a global appeal to suggest that God has a position and a stand when it comes to not only war, but acts of violence, interpersonal acts of violence. And one form that we are dealing with in our country right now at disproportionate rates is gun violence. And so I want to start with some good news. The first good news is since the start of 2023, there have only been one mass shooting in the United States that has killed more than 10 people. That's the good news. The good news is that laws are changing. The good news is that we are becoming more responsible state by state, and the media is becoming more responsible in how they report gun violence that occurs at the more local level versus the mass shootings that tend to swallow the headlines. That's the good news. The bad news is this. Almost every day since January 1st of this year, there has been at least one gun event that has led to one or more deaths in our nation. Gun violence continues to affect every community in one way or another. The Everytown Center for Gun Safety tracks the magnitude of the crisis that we are involved in. 46% of homes have at least one firearm. More than 81 million people own a gun in the United States. Every year, the gun industry sees a profit of over $9 billion, and that is climbing not incrementally, but exponentially. That's the bad news, or the sobering news. And we have to look at what the cost this is to our people, to people in this country in particular, when we are 26 more times likely to be impacted by a gun violence an event than anywhere else in the world. Gun violence kills more than 40,000 people every year. It wounds 80,000 people a year. 120 Americans die from gun violence every day. And estimates put the economic cost of gun violence, at roughly around $557 billion each year. And we cannot calculate or begin to calculate the human cost. Domestic violence victims. This is something that we tend to hear, these numbers, we're aware of this. Domestic violence victims are 5 times more likely to be killed when the abuser owns a gun. 2/3 of gun deaths are linked to suicide, and 85% of gun suicides are conducted by white men. So for white men, this is becoming an epidemic in the United States for the first time. Each year, over 3 million children are directly exposed to gun violence. Guns are now the leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 1 and 19. And so the CDC sees this as a public health crisis for our children, for all of our children. And gun violence has surpassed the number of children who die as a result of car accidents and then other forms of disease. This is the first time this has happened in our history. Princeton sociologist Patrick Sharkey found that children who took IQ tests within a week of shooting in their neighborhood scored at half the standard, half the average of other children taking an IQ test. So there is a cost. The children are not less intelligent, we know that. They are too preoccupied by fear caused by gun violence to learn and perform well in the classroom. And of the top 20 poorest neighborhoods in our country, the cities in particular, 80% were also the ones with the highest number of gun-related violence. Black Americans are twice as likely as white Americans to die from gun violence, 14 times more likely than white Americans to be wounded by guns. In 2018, 520 people were killed in a mass shooting in the United States, according to the book Bleeding Out. But during the same period, at least 100,000 people were killed in cities by gun violence. And the majority of those people were black and brown. They were people of color. They were not the victims of mass shootings. Economic insecurity and discriminatory housing practices that push people of color in particular into poverty, perpetuating economic inequality. It is connected to the rise in gun violence in our country. So there's a connection between poverty, the violence that we are doing to our children, the violence that we are doing to ourselves. And hearing these numbers, you may already have been numbed out. You may already have turned off. And hopefully you'll come back and ask me, Neal, help me understand those numbers. Help me understand the face behind some of those numbers. And for some of you, it is very personal. It is not a number. It's a person. It may even be yourself. What has been your own experience with guns? Is it primarily recreation? Is it hunting? Is it serving in the military? Is it purchasing a gun for protection, just in case? Does your profession require you to handle responsibly a firearm? Have you spoken with a relative or a dear friend about a vastly different perspective they have on gun violence in our country today? I did not grow up with guns in my home. My family is from India. The notion of holding a gun in India, guns were illegal for people to carry for the majority of Indian history, unless, especially under British colonial rule. And I was raised in Brooklyn, New York, and then suburban New Jersey. And my experience with guns happened through the YMCA, through a camp in the mountains of Massachusetts, where my closest friends and I learned to target shoot. And I learned how to use a rifle responsibly. Fast forward 5 years, and I'm running a food bank in Hartford, Connecticut. And the host of this church, it's an Episcopal church, they welcomed the food bank there. It was located in the basement of the church, but to get to the food bank, you had to come through the sanctuary. And so imagine you're walking into the sanctuary, and here I am, 22 years old, in Divinity School, working in a pantry, running this pantry. And the first thing I see as I walk through the sanctuary is embedded into the granite walls outside and within the church are rifles, handguns, bullets, in every shape and size. You enter the sanctuary, and above the altar is an embossed metal cross shaped out of disassembled gun parts, a barrel, a trigger, a spring, and a magazine. And on the church's roof is perched a huge cannon. You may wonder, how could this happen with a church? This was a church that was built during the Civil War. It was built as a memorial to a son who was fighting and who ultimately died in the Civil War. But the choice was to, I would argue, glorify the use of weapons, right? And to really sanctify them within the walls of the church. And I cannot judge the way they thought, but what does it feel like to walk into a church where you are surrounded by weapons, if you can imagine it? Now, come with me as I go to the basement of this church, where the food pantry is located. There's a mother who arrives, and as she walks into the pantry, one of the children, she has 2 sons, one of the children has a toy pistol and is pointing it at his brother, and he is shooting it repeatedly. And then when I ask him, hey man, what are you doing? Do you know who you're shooting? He responds to me and he says, nobody. Nobody. What is going on? Not in the life of that child alone, but in the life of the community and a nation that has created a toxic environment that has given this impression to this child that guns do not have consequences, and that this child, this baby, this child of God can do this to his brother. Friends, this happened to me more than 35 years ago, and I go back to this story because I still haven't figured it out. I still don't have a complete answer. When I was in Divinity School, I would sit on the quad in New Haven, and I would listen to shots being fired blocks away, wondering whether it was a hit or miss. It was quite common. It would go on late into the night. And then I would see as a chaplain later on at 2 a.m. in the morning, people arriving with gunshot wounds, and it was to be expected. The medical personnel and the chaplains were prepared. What does it say in our country when chaplains and medical professionals are overly prepared because we expect it to happen? It seems to be natural or normal, part of our DNA in our culture. So, and as some of you, I also, as I moved to Washington, D.C., and I've learned this area, I learned that I found myself adjusting where I would walk, where I would drive, following my sixth sense, knowing where I would be safe, where I would not be. These are all things that we've had to navigate and negotiate. I was with a group of young people 1 year ago, leading a spirituality and justice retreat, and the youth told me, they didn't hold back, they told me their greatest concern is not their score on their SAT. They told me their greatest concern is whether or not they will fit through the window of their classroom if there's an active shooter in the hallway in their school. What do you do with that? I mean, what do you do with that? In the scripture we have heard today, the prophet Micah. It is a minor prophet with a major message. This is a prophet who demands that we beat our swords into plowshares, our spears into pruning hooks, and at the very least, can't we beat our guns into non-existence? Can we simply commit to protecting our most vulnerable children by locking up guns? If we cannot beat them into plows, right? And pruning hooks. If we cannot follow the message of the prophet, can we at least store these weapons? I do not see any reason why we cannot claim Micah's prophetic word today. I do not see any reason why we cannot say that this can happen in our lifetime. And I think of Ryan Busey, who is an executive, a former vice president of sales for Kimber American from 1995 to 2020, a long time. He broke from the gun industry and decided to become a gun prevention advocate instead. He made a total turnaround. In his book, Gunfight, My Battle Against the Industry That Radicalized America, this is what Ryan says. 15 to 20 years ago, when the industry understood a sort of fragile social contract needed to be maintained, or something immensely powerful is the freedom to own guns, the industry didn't advertise in egregiously irresponsible ways. There was the unspoken code of conduct that the industry knew not to violate. Those seem to have broken down, he says. Now it's a kind of victory at all costs, he says. And sadly, I think there's a lot of the cost. Today, gun manufacturers refuse to innovate towards safety. They avoid the same accountability like the automobile and the tobacco and the pharmaceutical industries for safer practices. They manufacture increasingly deadly products, including military-style, high-capacity weapons, those designed primarily for concealment. And so today is the day that I imagine that Ryan testifying before God on that mountain, all the nations gathered together, and I see the mountain right here. I see the mountain in Washington, D.C. and Maryland. I see the mountain in West Virginia. I see the mountain not so far away, but very present with and amongst us. This is the place wherever we gather and God is present. This is the sacred mountain where God comes to meet the nations. And I can hear what Ryan says, and this is what he said in his book. I am a gun owner, and I hunt, and I shoot with my boys, and I want to continue doing that, and I believe that I have a right to do those things. On the other hand, I do not believe that rights can exist without a commensurate amount of responsibility. And that responsibility must be voluntary or it must be legislated, he says. Democracies function in a sort of carefully balanced gray area, and I think our balance in this country is way off right now. Today is the day. Today is the day when our swords are shaped into plowshares, our spears molded into pruning hooks. We stand alongside Ryan, those who've worked in the industry, those who've exited the industry, when he says, I don't think universal background checks are infringements on my rights. I just don't buy that. I think it's part of the responsibility of exercising this right. I don't think that strengthening red flag laws are in any way an infringement, he says. I don't think that controlling irresponsible marketing is an infringement on our Second Amendment rights, he says. Listen to what the prophet Micah has to say. All will sit down underneath their grapevines, their own fig trees. There will be no one to terrify them. There will be no one to terrify them, for the mouth of the Lord of heavenly hosts, has spoken. This is the promise. It is not an option. All victims and perpetrators and bystanders together. Micah trusts in what we may not yet see for ourselves. The fear, the terror of yet another senseless act of violence is replaced by generative grapevines, generative fig trees. Tremendous power here in these natural images to transform entire organic environments on God's sacred mountain. And they are indicative of what we are capable of doing as church. Much of this happens underground. It takes time. It happens because of their roots. The fig tree and the grapevine, they do their work where we don't see it happening always. It's not as obvious. Their roots grow down. They also grow out. Grapevines and fig tree roots grow horizontally. They reach beyond fences and walls and boundaries. Their roots have the power to regenerate, to give space to new life so that it can spring up. And isn't this how we as a church are to be when we are at our best? We are committed to a future we cannot yet see, knowing that we are those who work to till the ground, take time to plant, water, nurture, allow the roots to do the work. We move beyond the expected boundaries on this. In other words, we not only challenge existing legislation, but public policies. And we change the public conversation on how best to promote human dignity and alleviate human suffering and the causes of gun violence. So I want to end with this. Hopeful examples of what we as people of God are actually doing in our nation to address this crisis. The Live Free campaign practices walkthroughs, not drive-bys. Communities led walkthroughs that address white supremacist violence before it takes place in fragile communities. They walk the neighborhood. Mercy Investment Services filed a shareholder resolution at Dick's Sporting Goods. I've shopped at Dick's. I don't know about some of you, but I've shopped at Dick's. That led to a company's decision to stop selling assault-style weapons at its Field and Stream stores. It raised the minimum age of gun purchases to 21. Heeding God's Call organizes memorials to the lost by displaying T-shirts with the names of people killed by gun violence. Shirts are placed in front of a congregation's building in a public space. So there are 8 locations so far. They're looking for additional locations, friends. They're looking for churches that will host them in the Mid-Atlantic. Soulbox Project folds origami memorials to honor each person's life, and they place their name on each one. anyone who has been lost to gun violence. In October 2021, they carried 200,000 soul boxes to the National Mall. And these represent the number of people in the United States harmed by gun violence in less than 3 years. Sojourners started a church boycott of the NRA in the wake of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting in Parkland, Florida, to provide a space for Christians to voice opposition to gun violence. We have an opportunity this week to stand alongside survivors of the Parkland violence and to go to be with the survivors who have come to hold a sit-in across from the United States Senate. They're there for 10 days. They're there to talk with anybody about their experience of how gun violence has impacted them and to share their stories as sisters and brothers and cousins and survivors. And there's an action alert that we've created, so we invite you to sign on to let your legislators know that you believe that banning assault rifles, AR-15 kind of weapons, is consistent with what our United Methodist social teaching says. Soon after the tragedy in Parkland, there was a woman by the name of Hadia Pendleton, who was a majorette and high school student from the south side of Chicago, who had marched in President Obama's second inaugural parade, and yet she was killed while right after taking her final exams in her school. And after she was killed, her friends decided that they would find a way to commemorate her life. And they realized that the best way to do it would be to wear orange for the rest of the school year. Why orange? Why orange? To symbolize the value of human life. Just as hunters who use guns appropriately wear orange in their woods to protect themselves and others, so today we wear orange. My spouse gave me an orange and pink scarf to bring and share with you, but we wear orange. We wear orange as a sign of courage, as a sign of protection. Scripture says, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of God, Jacob's God, so that God may teach us God's ways and we may walk in God's paths. And God will instruct us from Zion." And the words, "Lord," came from Jerusalem. My prayer, my friends, is that we will come together. We will create that mountaintop experience. We will not only learn and educate ourselves and our friends and our siblings and our children, but that we will find a way to heed, to listen, to act, to come together. This is what we've seen people doing across the aisle. Can we do any less? Amen.